It was 1945. The bloodiest war in history had ended. Europe was in ruins, Germany defeated, and the Allies celebrated victory. Among the victors, one name shone with its own light: George Smith Patton, the general who had defied the logic of modern warfare, the man who believed that speed and courage could crush any obstacle. But while the world rejoiced in peace, Patton did not smile. For him, the war wasn't over. It had only changed its face. We defeated the wrong enemy. Just a few weeks after the end of the conflict, the general most feared by the Germans, the one most admired by his men, would die in an absurd accident on a forgotten road in Germany. A crash without explosions, without gunfire, without enemies. Just a truck, a Cadillac, and a silence that would last for decades. How could a man who had survived bullets, bombings, and politics die like that? Was it truly an accident? Or did someone decide Patton had said too much? This is the story of the last warrior. The man who won all his battles except the most important one, the battle for his own truth. Before his death, George Patton had been a child with an obsession: war. To understand the mystery of his end, one must first understand who this man really was. Someone who could not live without fighting. Because the accident that killed him cannot be explained without knowing the life that shaped him. And the story of the last warrior did not begin on a battlefield. George Smith Patton was born in November 1885 in San Gabriel, California, into a family where war was not a tragedy, but a legacy. His grandfather had been a Confederate general in the Civil War, and his father, a fervent patriot, raised him on stories of battles, honor, and sacrifice. From childhood, George grew up believing that his destiny did not lie in comfort or caution, but on the battlefield. From a young age, he showed an unusual obsession with military history. He read about Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Napoleon. He memorized tactics and dates, as if preparing for a campaign of his own. He had a boundless imagination, but also an inflexible character. He suffered from dyslexia, which made reading and writing difficult, but he compensated with an extraordinary visual memory. His mother used to say that, although he struggled to write his own name, he could recall the names of every general in history. In 1903, he entered the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. There, he forged his identity. His strong personality and limitless ambition made him both admired and disliked. He was not the best student in the classroom, but on the training field, he stood out for his precision, discipline, and constant desire for perfection. He believed greatness was an obligation. "I don't want to be a good soldier," he said. "I want to be the best that has ever existed." In 1909, he married Beatrice Eyre, a woman from a wealthy, intelligent, and patient family who would be his companion throughout his life. Beatrice was the balance his spirit never had. While he pursued glory on the battlefield, she maintained the calm and the home that awaited him upon every return. His first real military experience came in 1916, when the United States sent troops to Mexico to capture Pancho Villa. There, Patton took part in a skirmish in which he killed several bandits. It was his first combat, his first real encounter with death. That night, he wrote in his diary, "I felt alive. This must be what a soldier feels." During World War I, Patton found his purpose. In France, he joined the Tank Corps, a technology still new and underestimated. He became a pioneer in its tactical use. He studied them, adapted them, turned them into an extension of his will. He led attacks on the Saint-Mihiel front and was wounded in combat. He refused evacuation until securing victory. His bravery earned him recognition and promotion. There was born the myth of the warrior who advanced without fear, even when all seemed lost. Upon returning to the United States after the armistice, Patton did not rest. He dedicated himself to studying strategy, military history, and mechanics. He trained troops, wrote combat manuals, and designed maneuvers that would become the foundation of modern warfare. He believed the army should move with the speed of thought and with the force of a single blow. Slowness, he said, is the soldier's worst enemy. Outside the battlefield, he was a complex man, devout, superstitious, convinced that his soul had lived in other soldiers throughout history. At times, he claimed to have been a warrior in past lives. His men saw him as a brilliant madman, his superiors as a dangerous genius. In the 1930s, while the world trembled before the rise of fascism, Patton was already warning that a new war was inevitable. He studied European armies, wrote about the power of armored movement, and trained relentlessly. He did not seek war out of love for violence, but out of conviction. He believed conflict was the stage on which man revealed his true worth. Thus, when history ignited again in 1939, George S. Patton was ready. The child who played at being a soldier, the young man who fought his own mind, the man who dreamed of honor, was about to step onto the stage for which he had been born. The world would soon know the general who tolerated no defeat and who demanded that his men be as relentless as he was. Everything he had learned, everything he had suffered and dreamed since childhood, led him to that moment. World War II became the stage where his brilliant mind and fierce character could unfold without limits. The meticulous soldier who had studied Caesar and Napoleon transformed into the general most feared by the Germans and most controversial among the Allies. His tanks moved like lightning. His voice was a blend of fury and faith, and his presence inspired as much respect as fear. But as his legend grew on the battlefield, his indomitable spirit began to collide with something stronger than any army: politics. The man who had been born to fight would soon discover that not all enemies wore uniforms. Thus began a new chapter in his story, the story of a general who did not fit in. When World War II broke out, George Smith Patton was nearly 55 years old. For many, he was too old for combat. For him, it was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. He firmly believed that war was the stage where a man proved his true worth, and that victory was not achieved through diplomacy, but through determination. Patton did not want to be remembered as a good officer. He wanted to be remembered as a conqueror. In 1942, he was sent to North Africa. There, the U.S. Army had suffered its first major defeat at Kasserine Pass against Rommel's German forces. The troops were demoralized, without direction. Then Patton appeared, his helmet polished, his ivory-handled pistol at his side, and his gaze that seemed to cut through steel. In his first speech, he made it clear that a new kind of commander had arrived. "I want every man here to think that we're not here to die for our country. We're here to make the enemy die for theirs." From that moment on, his reputation grew through a mixture of admiration and fear. He imposed discipline with almost fanatical severity. He inspected uniforms, forbade carelessness, punished disorder. He conducted personal inspections, shouted, demanded, and at the same time inspired absolute loyalty. His soldiers followed him because they knew he would never ask for something he wasn't willing to do himself. In the heat of battle, he was always at the front. He was the first to advance and the last to fall back. In just a few months, he transformed a disorganized army into an efficient war machine. The success of the Tunisian campaign propelled him to lead the invasion of Sicily in 1943. There, Patton demonstrated his talent for speed and surprise. They landed on the western side of the island, while British General Bernard Montgomery advanced from the east. Both men competed silently, and sometimes not so silently, to see who would reach Messina first, the key to the Mediterranean. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery became legendary. Montgomery, methodical and calculating, despised the recklessness of his American counterpart. Patton, impatient and bold, considered Montgomery a man without instinct. While the British advanced slowly, Patton took impossible routes, crossed mountains, and attacked relentlessly. The result was a race between the two armies for glory, one that confused Allied command, but fascinated the soldiers. In the end, Patton arrived first. He liberated Messina before the British, and he did it without asking permission. The feat was militarily brilliant, but politically disastrous. Montgomery and Churchill were furious. Eisenhower, his former friend, began to see him as a threat to Allied unity. It was during that same campaign that the incident occurred, which would mark his career. During a visit to a field hospital, Patton approached a young soldier suffering from combat fatigue. The boy trembled, unable to hold his rifle. Patton, unable to comprehend fear, slapped him and called him a coward. The incident, leaked to the press, became a national scandal. Newspapers called him brutal, inhuman. Roosevelt and Eisenhower were forced to react. Patton was removed from command. For the first time, the general who never retreated had to stay still. For months, he lived in the shadows. In his diary, he wrote, "Inaction is worse than death. I would rather fall in battle than die of boredom." Isolated in his quarters, he watched other commanders rise while he was left behind. Even so, he continued working, preparing maps, studying operations, waiting for a chance to return to the front. Eisenhower knew that sooner or later he would need his best warrior. Because in modern war, Patton's speed was as valuable as any weapon. That opportunity came in 1944. The Allies had landed in Normandy, but the advance was slow. Montgomery was stalled in the north, and Bradley's forces could not break the German lines. Eisenhower needed a decisive blow, so he unleashed his secret weapon, Patton. With the creation of the Third Army, the general returned to the front with all his fury bottled inside. In a few weeks, his army liberated more territory than any other Allied force. From Normandy to Metz, his tanks seemed to move like a storm. Every day, the war reports carried the same name, Patton. His enemies feared him. The Germans intercepted messages about him and considered him the most dangerous Allied commander in the West. They said, "Where Patton is, there is the attack." As his fame grew, so did the discomfort among the high command. Patton was not a man who could be easily controlled. He mocked bureaucracy, despised orders he didn't understand, and openly criticized politicians. Once he commented to the press that democracy is no good for fighting wars. His words, though spoken with military frankness, caused diplomatic storms. Eisenhower reprimanded him, but also admired him. He knew that without Patton, many battles would have ended differently. The rivalry with Montgomery remained intense throughout the European campaign. In conferences, the British general took credit for victories, and Patton endured it with a forced smile and clenched fists. They symbolized two opposite visions of war: Montgomery, calculation; Patton, action. Where one hesitated, the other attacked. And amid this contrast, the world began to divide between those who feared Patton and those who idolized him. However, the same intensity that made him invincible on the battlefield made him an uncomfortable enemy off it. His disdain for politics, his volcanic temper, and his unfiltered tongue were beginning to cost him dearly. Patton understood nothing of diplomacy or subtleties. He believed the truth should be spoken even if it destroyed friendships, even if it cost him command. And with every word, with every gesture, he drifted farther from the power that had elevated him. The war was not yet over, but George Patton had already begun to fight another one, a silent struggle, not against Germany, but against his own side, against the generals who envied him, the politicians who feared him, and the Allies who wanted to see him fail. Because in the heart of an army of identical uniforms, there was one man who never fit in. And that man, George S. Patton, was beginning to understand that being a hero could also be a curse. Europe burned and dimmed at the same time. As the Allied armies pushed the Germans back toward their own border, the world celebrated the coming victory. But amid the applause, George S. Patton began to feel something he had never known: the weight of isolation. He had won every battle he had been given, but he was losing the most dangerous war: politics. His victories, instead of giving him power, had earned him enemies. The British despised him for his arrogance, the Soviets feared him for his bluntness, and his own superiors watched him with suspicion, afraid of what he might say or do. In the command halls, his name was spoken cautiously. On the battlefields, his men revered him like a god. That contradiction consumed him. How could he be the most brilliant general of the war, and at the same time the most censored? Patton did not know it, but the last months of the conflict would be the most decisive of his life. When the external enemy began to collapse, the real danger would emerge from within. Because after crossing the Rhine and reaching the heart of Germany, the general would discover that victory did not bring honor, but suspicion, politics, and betrayal. Thus began the next chapter of his story: the inconvenient general who did not know how to remain silent. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the world erupted in joy. Bells rang in London, newspapers in New York printed "Victory in Europe," and the Allied leaders congratulated one another for having defeated absolute evil. But among the victors, there was one man who did not smile. George S. Patton, the most feared and respected general in the U.S. Army, did not see a clear victory, but a new threat forming on the horizon. While others celebrated the end of the war, he felt that the real battle was only beginning. Patton had led the Third Army across half of Europe, with a speed that astonished even his enemies. In just a few weeks, he had liberated more than 12,000 towns, captured hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, and advanced more than 1,000 kilometers in a single month. His army was feared and admired, a symbol of American determination. But once the guns fell silent, the very courage that had made him a hero began to turn into a problem. In the months after Germany's surrender, Patton became the military governor of Bavaria, responsible for overseeing the occupation and reconstruction of the southern part of the country. However, this new role clashed with everything he was. He was not a politician, nor a diplomat, nor a bureaucrat. He was a soldier, accustomed to the brutal clarity of war, not the half-truths of politics. And from the very first day, he began to clash with Allied decisions, especially the policy of denazification, which required removing all former members of the Nazi Party from administrative, educational, and technical positions. Patton saw it as a strategic mistake. He insisted that many of those men had not been fanatics, but simple functionaries, and that without them, the country would be paralyzed. He expressed it with his characteristic bluntness. Not all Germans were Nazis, just as not all Russians are communists. And he went even further. We defeated the wrong enemy. That phrase, spoken before U.S. officers, fell like a bomb. Patton did not mean sympathy for Nazism, but rather his conviction that the real danger was not Germany, but the Soviet Union. He believed that by destroying German military power, the Allies had left Europe at Stalin's mercy. His warnings seemed paranoid at the time, but history, decades later, would give them an unsettling ring of truth. In his diaries, Patton wrote, "I cannot help thinking that we fought to hand Europe over to the Russians, and our leaders refused to see it." It was a direct criticism of Roosevelt, Churchill, and especially Eisenhower, his former friend and now supreme commander in Europe. The relationship between them deteriorated quickly. Eisenhower admired him as a soldier, but feared his statements. Every press conference, every comment he made, generated diplomatic tension. Patton did not hold back. He didn't know how. In his mind, a soldier's duty was to tell the truth, not to please politicians. As his words reached Washington, the patience of the high command ran out. Some viewed him as a public threat, an unpredictable man with too much prestige and too much influence. His internal enemies seized on every sentence, portraying him as an extremist, a military man out of control. Eisenhower, who had been his protector during the war, began to distance himself. There were secret meetings, classified reports, and finally a decision. Patton had to be relieved of command. By late 1945, he was quietly removed from the administration of Bavaria. His new post would be the Fifth Army, a purely ceremonial position, with no real authority and no active troops. It was an elegant form of exile. The hero who had led the U.S. Army to victory was now a political problem that needed to be silenced. Patton understood immediately. In his diary, he wrote, "They removed me for telling the truth. Politics has defeated war." And in a conversation with a military journalist, he uttered a sentence many would remember after his death. "They want me silent. But as long as I live, I will keep talking." From that moment, suspicion began to grow that the general was walking on dangerous ground. He had touched on subjects no one dared to mention, had pointed to the Soviets as the real enemy, and had criticized the policy of the Allies themselves. He was a soldier who did not know how to keep quiet. And in the halls of power, some were beginning to think that perhaps it would be better if he did. Permanently. While Europe signed agreements, drew new borders, and held victory parades, he watched with growing concern as the Soviets advanced relentlessly westward. In just a few months, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and part of Germany had fallen under the control of the Red Army. Patton saw what few were willing to admit. The war had not ended. It had merely changed shape. And the next one, he believed, would not be against Hitler, but against Stalin. In internal briefings, and in the journals he wrote by hand each night, Patton repeated an idea that scandalized his superiors. "Do not trust the Russians. They understand neither honor, nor their word, nor compassion. They are barbarians in uniform." His warnings were not the frustrated outbursts of a weary soldier. They were strategic assessments based on what he had seen with his own eyes. The Soviets were not withdrawing from the areas they occupied. They were seizing German resources and subjugating the population with the same brutality the Nazis had used. Patton, trained to read troop movements, understood that this was not a temporary occupation, but the prelude to something much greater. In a letter to his wife Beatrice, he wrote, "Our politicians are blind. They think Stalin is an ally because he smiles in photographs, but behind that smile lies ambition. We defeated the wrong enemy and left free the one who will destroy us." That phrase, the same one he had repeated publicly, began circulating discreetly among Allied command. Many found it intolerable. Patton no longer spoke like a general, but like a man who believed himself above politics and in the fragile post-war Europe that was dangerous. As tensions with the Soviet Union grew, Washington aimed for a cautious, diplomatic, restrained policy. The Allies needed to preserve the appearance of unity until reconstruction treaties were signed. But Patton refused to tone down his language. In private meetings with British officers, he even said, "We should turn our backs on the Russians and rearm the Germans. They are the only ones who can stop Stalin." It was unthinkable. The very general who had crushed the German army was now proposing to arm it again. His superiors began to see him as an internal threat. Every time he spoke, diplomats shuddered. His name, once synonymous with courage, now appeared attached to the word problem. Eisenhower summoned him to his office and tried to reason with him. He asked for discretion, reminded him the war was over, that the army served the government and not the other way around. Patton listened, then replied with a cold sentence. "Politics should not dictate morality, Ike, and what you are doing is not moral." In his final months in Germany, he began writing notes for a book he planned to publish upon returning to the United States. He called it The War That Was Not Won. He said it would reveal everything the men in power do not want the people to know. His aides saw him every night in his office, writing by hand, consulting maps, reviewing campaign journals. They sensed something was being prepared, something larger than a simple military memoir. It was his way of settling accounts with those who, in his view, had betrayed the principles for which so many had died. Some officers who met with him during those weeks recalled that he spoke of returning to Washington and telling everything. He claimed to have proof of hidden decisions, backroom deals with Stalin, deliberate mistakes made during the final offensive. And although he never revealed the details of what he intended to expose, he made it clear that his homecoming would not be quiet. One American journalist who managed to interview him briefly later wrote, "Patton seemed like a man at war with the very army he had served." Around him, the atmosphere grew tense. Reports of his statements multiplied. Washington feared that such a popular hero might turn against the official narrative. Eisenhower was preparing to begin his political career, and Patton, with his incendiary tongue, could bring them all down with him. The Soviets, for their part, considered him a declared enemy. Rumors circulated in Moscow that he had proposed invading them before they developed the atomic bomb. And in the shadows, both in Europe and the United States, whispers began to spread. The general was talking too much, and knew too much. Patton was not unaware of this. In his diary, he wrote a short, almost prophetic line in November. "I have survived all my enemies on the battlefield, but I am not sure I will survive those in my own country." Shortly after writing that sentence, he decided his time in Germany was over. He planned to return home at the end of December. He had the draft of his memoirs nearly finished, and several interviews lined up with American journalists. He said that, at last, he would speak freely. But before he could do so, fate, or perhaps something else, interrupted his journey. On December 9th, 1945, dawn broke cold and gray in southwestern Germany. General George S. Patton was preparing for a hunting trip with his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. He was relaxed, in good spirits, talking about his imminent return to the United States. He planned to travel in a few weeks, spend Christmas at home, and begin writing his memoirs. After months of tension, that day seemed to be one of the few calm moments he had enjoyed since the end of the war. He could not imagine it would be his last. The car he was traveling in, a 1939 Cadillac, moved along a straight, open road between Mannheim and Speyer. Driving was his regular chauffeur, Soldier Horace Woodring, an experienced man who had served with him for months. There was no heavy snow, no thick fog, only a low sky and the silence of a devastated country. Suddenly, at a railway crossing, a GMC military truck cut across their path. The driver, a young American soldier, swerved sharply to avoid another stopped vehicle and crossed directly in front of the Cadillac. Woodring braked with all his strength, but it was useless. The impact was light, almost insignificant. No fire, no rollover, no explosion. And yet, Patton was the only one seriously injured. The blow threw him against the metal frame of the car's roof. He suffered a fracture of the third cervical vertebra. He remained conscious but was paralyzed from the neck down. His first comment, according to his aide, was calm and precise, as if he were analyzing a battlefield maneuver. "I've broken my neck. This is very serious." No one else in the car was harmed, neither Woodring nor Gay, nor even the truck's driver. All uninjured, only the general. He was immediately taken to the military hospital in Heidelberg. There, the doctors confirmed the worst. The injury was irreversible. Patton would never walk again. Over the following days, he remained lucid, though his voice grew weaker. He received few visitors and spoke little. His wife Beatrice traveled from the United States and stayed by his side. She later recalled that Patton, in a moment of absolute clarity, told her, "I feel like they're letting me die. This was no accident." The circumstances of the crash began to raise suspicion from the start. Official reports were scarce and contradictory. No detailed photographs of the accident site were taken. The truck involved disappeared from Army records days later. The driver was questioned briefly, declared innocent, and immediately reassigned. He was never found again. Even witnesses at the scene gave conflicting accounts. Some claimed the truck stopped. Others said it accelerated at the last moment. Nothing matched completely. Patton, meanwhile, seemed to understand the silence surrounding him. He knew he was an inconvenient figure. He had spoken too much, said things Allied leaders preferred to bury. And now, immobile and isolated, he realized his enemies no longer wore uniforms. In his diary, the final lines he dictated to his aide were brief. "Death is circling me, but the truth does not die with me." On December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident, George S. Patton officially died of a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. He was buried in the military cemetery of Hamm in Luxembourg, alongside the men of his Third Army, as he had wished. The funeral was discreet, almost silent. No grand honors, no political speeches. A modest end for a man feared by Hitler and respected by Eisenhower. But his death left more questions than answers. Why was no full formal investigation conducted? Why were Army documents concealed? Why did the vehicle involved disappear? And above all, why had Patton said weeks earlier that he was not sure he would survive the enemies within his own country? Over the decades, researchers, journalists, and former officers have speculated about what happened. Some believe it was an unfortunate accident. Others argue he was eliminated under orders from high command, fearful of what he intended to reveal. There are even claims of involvement by Soviet intelligence who viewed him as a threat to the stability of the occupation in Europe. Nothing has ever been conclusively proven. But in the echo of his death, the feeling persists. George S. Patton did not fall in battle, but in silence. A silence too convenient, at a moment when the truth could have disrupted the new world order that had just been born. And so ended the life of the general who never surrendered, the man who defied even history, the soldier who won every war except the last one, the one he fought against his own allies. The U.S. Army communicated his passing in a restrained statement. General Patton has died from medical complications resulting from an automobile accident. Nothing more. No massive ceremonies. No public honors. No speeches. A war hero reduced to a brief note in the newspapers. But outside the official communiqué, in hallways, in soldiers' bars, in journalists' offices, a question began to circulate, one that would never disappear. Was it really an accident? The first doubts arose among those who knew him best. His aides and close officers knew that Patton had made enemies at every level of power. He had criticized the British, irritated the Soviets, and infuriated Eisenhower himself. He said what he thought without a filter, making him unpredictable, even dangerous, at a time when politics demanded silence and discipline. He knew too much, had too many opinions, and too much influence. And just when he planned to return to the United States to write his memoirs, he died under improbable circumstances, in a minor accident that affected only him. The script was so perfect it seemed suspicious. For years afterward, the official version remained unchanged. No detailed military documents, no complete forensic report, no photograph of the crash was ever released. Many of those records simply vanished. The vehicle involved in the collision was decommissioned and destroyed. The truck driver, identified only as a maintenance soldier, was reassigned shortly afterward and never heard from again. Patton's own chauffeur, Horace Woodring, stated decades later that superiors ordered him not to speak about the accident to anyone. Some pointed to an internal conspiracy orchestrated by sectors of the U.S. Army who feared the explosive statements Patton planned to make upon returning home. Others blamed Soviet intelligence, which considered him a threat to post-war stability. There were even those who believed his death had been authorized from the highest levels as part of a tacit agreement between both sides to avoid a premature conflict. The Cold War was just beginning, and Patton, with his voice and popularity, could have ignited the spark too early. In 1979, journalist Robert Wilcox published an investigation claiming he had located a former OSS agent, the precursor to the CIA, who confessed to having participated in the operation to eliminate Patton. According to this version, the general had been injured in the accident, but killed in the hospital with a lethal injection. There is no conclusive proof, but the story reignited the controversy. The Army denied all accusations, calling them conspiracy theories, but never offered a more detailed explanation. And once again, the silence fueled the mystery. Beyond all theories, one thing is undeniable. Patton was a man out of his time, a warrior born for an era of total wars who could not adapt to the politics of newly emerging empires. His worldview was uncomfortable, his honesty brutal, his sense of honor absolute. In his diary, just days before his death, he wrote a line that seemed to summarize everything. "They fear what I say more than what I did." And that says a lot about the world we are building. With the passing years, his figure became myth. Movies, books, speeches, all attempted to decipher the man behind the uniform. Was he a hero or a fanatic? A prophet or a madman? Perhaps both. His warnings about Soviet expansionism came true almost word for word. The Berlin Wall, the Korean War, the nuclear arms race. Everything he predicted began to materialize only a few years after his death. And with each new conflict, Patton's shadow grew larger. Today, his grave in Luxembourg remains a place of pilgrimage. Soldiers, historians, and curious visitors stop before his simple headstone, engraved with his name and rank. Nothing more. No symbols, no epic phrases, just silence. A silence many interpret as a perfect metaphor for his end. The man who spoke too much was buried beneath a silence that still echoes. George S. Patton was perhaps the last general who believed war was a matter of honor, not politics. He died as he lived, defiant, uncomfortable, convinced that the truth must be spoken even at the cost of one's life. Patton was a soldier who never fully fit into the political world he helped create. He won decisive battles, changed the course of the war, and yet was pushed aside for saying what others kept silent. His view of the world, raw, direct, and in many ways prophetic, made him a threat in times of fragile alliances. He said the Soviets would not stop in Berlin, that peace with them was an illusion, and that Western leaders were handing Europe over to a dark future. Decades later, history seemed to prove him right. And yet, the most unsettling part is not what he said, but what he never had the chance to say. His memoirs, which promised to reveal uncomfortable secrets about the post-war agreements, were never published. Some fragments appeared years later, edited, incomplete, as if someone had decided what could be remembered and what had to disappear. Not even his personal belongings survived untouched. Parts of his diaries went missing, pages were torn out, documents were classified by the Army and never declassified. Silence once again covered his story. Over time, his figure became myth. Hollywood immortalized him as an arrogant and brilliant general, But behind the cinematic character was the real man. Disciplined to the point of obsession, deeply religious, convinced he was fulfilling a divine mission. His military legacy is unquestionable, but his moral legacy remains open for debate. Was he a misunderstood hero or a fanatic who didn't know when to stop? A patriot who saw danger before anyone else, or an obstacle to peace? And above all, was his death the natural end of a dangerous life, or the calculated silencing of a voice that knew too much? Today, when people speak of conspiracies, hidden truths, and the manipulation of power, Patton's name resurfaces. His story does not belong only to the past. It echoes in every era in which truth is inconvenient, and the brave pay for speaking it. Because George S. Patton was not just a war general, he was a reminder of what happens when a man dares to speak in a world that prefers to remain silent. And now I ask you, do you think Patton's death was truly an accident, or that someone wanted to silence him forever? Was he a victim of his Soviet enemies, or of his own allies? And what would have happened if he had lived long enough to reveal what he knew? Leave your theory in the comments. I want to read what you think about this mystery that continues to divide historians. Give this video a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes.